Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, it is one thing to make hyperbolic statements on your social media platform or in front of the incompetent Western media, but it's a much different thing when you say these things in front of the world at the UN. And this is exactly what President Trump did when, for all intents and purposes, gave the green light to Europe to keep supporting Ukraine in their ongoing fight with Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth discussing this because amongst the many ridiculous statements Trump made was he talked about Russia being a paper tiger. Well, considering all the bluster that the United States came out with, I'm going to end the war in 24 hours, and all the threatening statements made to Russia, if you don't do this, we'll do this. And, now he's reached the point where he realizes this is pointless. Russia isn't going to listen to anything I say. And we, the United States, are the paper tiger. We're the ones who are going to have to find the exit strategy. I'm going to make a hyperbolic statement. It's very inflammatory. It's going to wind up the Europeans to continue the fight. And we can just walk out of the exit door and leave Europe to face the music. And they'll have to deal with the fallout of everything. And we can go, well, it's nothing to do with us. Because, as he says, we will continue to supply weapons to NATO and for NATO to do what they want with them. So we're supporting, we did everything we could. We gave you the arms to give to Ukraine so they could apparently win this war. Very interesting. Nonsense, of course, but, very clever strategy to get out the back door. So, in essence, one of the major points with this, amongst quite a few, is this is Trump's way of going, we can't do anything to affect this war. We certainly can't persuade the Ukrainians to do what we like them to do. We've got no chance with the Russians. So the war's just going to carry on. And interestingly, apparently, Trump changed his mind because Zelensky told him that everything Putin said in Alaska was a lie. And I'm going to tell you the truth about what's happening in Ukraine, which of course is nonsense equally. Not least, I mean, if Russia's losing, why have they taken dozens of settlements now in Dnipro region, for as one example, and continue to make advancements? It's obvious there's only one country winning the war, and it doesn't begin with the letter U, it begins with the letter R. So, in essence, that's my kind of intro to this. And we're going to dissect some of the points that are made and why they're being made, and why this is just a rallying cry for Europe to carry on, because Europe has to carry on, but with extremely important provisos around what that means for their engagement with Russia. And it certainly doesn't mean any direct engagement. It never has, and it never will, because rather like the United States, if they had direct conflict with Russia, that's World War III. That's a nuclear war, even though people seem to think there's going to be this, still think there's going to be this long, protracted conventional war where someone's going to win that and they're going to shake hands and go, well, well done, you've won the war. What does this mean? They're not going to. They're going to instantly press the nuclear option because countries with nuclear weapons do that, because they're not going to wait to find out the other side's pressed it. And that will be catastrophic for Europe. And we have to hope, and I'm not really hopeful because we know it won't happen. But if it did, it would be devastating. So who the hell wants that to happen? Not even the most stupid people in Europe or in the United States or the United Kingdom really believe that. They'll say all kinds of hyperbolic statements publicly, privately. It's the absolute last thing they want to happen because it's about self-preservation. So what are they going to do? Be blown to smithereens? Well, how does that benefit them? Not at all.
I think one of the hardest things, and especially for maybe not particularly those who listen to our channel, but just the great populace that they're out there listening, is you and I don't necessarily name drop very often, but there's somebody that we respect their opinion. I think you probably agree with me, Jeffrey Sachs, who is a
Yeah,
historian
absolutely.
and takes a look at that. He did an interview yesterday following Trump's words at the UN, and he implied, he didn't come out and absolutely say it, but he implied that uh, after Trump spoke at the UN, World War III is inevitable. Now, I was shocked at all of this because, the reality is that Europe and the United States, neither is in any position at all to continue supporting Ukraine or even to do anything of substance when it comes to facing off with the superpowers. We're talking obviously Russia, China, maybe Iran. But I think the implication there is that when a world leader stands at the UN before everybody else and makes bold statements of the sort, people are expected to believe this is exactly what their leaders and their government intends to do. And that to me is the scariest thing of all because you put it out there that this is your stance, your policy. And if it doesn't come to pass, then you lose complete integrity with not only your supporters, but with the world at large. And if it does come to pass, then you're going to go down in history as just the individual who brought about the destruction of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I can understand why people say things but the end of the day, no one wants World War III. No one in the United States, nobody in Europe, because the consequences are self-explanatory. Trump can go makes hyperbolic statements and retracts them or says something different tomorrow because he doesn't care. He's just there to throw a hand grenade into proverbial hand grenade into the proceedings, see what the hell happens. And he doesn't do it because he wants World War III or he expects World War III. He thinks it'll just rattle some cages. It'll get the cooler heads inside Ukraine and Russia and Europe to go, well, we're going to have to do something about this sensibly. Totally misreading the room, which is effectively that Russia doesn't care what Trump says. They're not at all interested in any of his statements. It doesn't change their perspective on the war. It doesn't change Ukraine's perspective on the war. In fact, the latest statements he's made is only going to embolden them, and he's trying to embolden Europe to take on the mantle of being the proxy, not the United States anymore. Basically, we'll just give the weapons, you do what you want, which is why Trump then came out and went on about, oh, I understand the Ukraine Russian military. I understand the economic situation. Oh, Russia's in all this economic trouble, which it isn't. Its economy's grown at 4%. Its deficit's a quarter of what the United States is. Its debt to GDP is a sixth of the United States. Based on official figures, it's probably way higher. And in essence, it has no net debt. The Russian economy is not in any trouble. So then, of course, you go, well, I think Ukraine, and if Europe, remember, it's Europe supports them, not the United States. Oh, they can win, and they can win back all of the territory they've lost. And if they keep the war going, and you get the financial support of Europe, and meaning the NATO countries, then the original borders will be returned to what they were pre the start of the war. Oh, and why not? Because Russia's aimlessly fighting the war for 3.5 years. And if they were this real military power, they'd have taken it all in less than a week. I mean, so, and which of course does he really believe this? No, I simply don't believe because when he went to Alaska, the Americans returned crestfallen because they got a dose of the truth and the reality of what was going on. Now we can sit there and go, well, I've spoken to Zelensky and now I know what the real truth is. This is just an excuse to say to Europe, you can go full bore, but not you're going to war with Russia because they won't. But you need to throw the kitchen sink at it. Give them all the money they want. We'll give you all the arms. We can just keep this war going because all he wants is for the United States to sell loads of arms because the United States can make lots of money at the expense of bankrupting Europe and eventually destroying Ukraine in totality. And probably in reality, he knows that's exactly what the outcome is. But he's also trying to antagonize and humiliate the Russians, but it doesn't work. Call them a paper tiger. Well, the US is the paper tiger. And how all these Russians all over the country are going to find out what's really going on with the war as though they don't already know. And, and then all this nonsense about Russians not being able to fill their cars up with, as you call it in the US, gas, and all the other things that are destroying their economy, and they're spending all their money on fighting Ukraine, which is absolute nonsense. And and somehow Ukraine's going to be able to take back their country. Oh, and you know what? They may start taking bits of Russia in the process. This is just hyperbolic nonsense. I mean, and it's so extreme. This is just to fire up the Ukrainians, fire up the Russians, the Europeans, to keep the war going. And Europe wants the war to keep going because the European politicians know if it ends, Ukraine loses. The war's over. Not just the war's over, sorry. Their political careers are in the dustbin. It's over for all of them because they can't justify a crushing defeat and everything that they said for 3.5 years. Now it destroys economies and the financial system, destroys society. So this is a way for the US to exit stage left, to sound fiercely critical of Russia, meaning in a meaningless way that actually doesn't carry any gravity, and Russia doesn't really care a word they say. But it sounds like we're being tough on Russia still because Russia isn't doing what we want them to do. Well, Russia never was going to do anything that the United States or anyone else wants them to do. It's very simple from Russia's perspective, agree or disagree. There's an SMO. These are the core issues that need dealing with. We're going to deal with them. We can end it today, but if not, the war carries on until we implement these policies, whatever that means in reality. But the question is, how much longer can Europe and Ukraine fight a war? Because you can throw money at it. But if you've got no weapons, you can't fight a war. And Europe's running on fumes. The United States is running on fumes. So how long left? They may have earmarked certain weapons for Ukraine, but remember, they sent a lot of stuff to Israel that was destined for Ukraine. That was all blown up by the Iranians. So there's not that much left. So how much longer can the war continue? I think the US knows in reality it can't. So they just want Europe to go down in flames, to be blamed for everything, and go, well, it was out of our hands. We did everything we could to support the war effort. Look, we were savage and we criticized Russia, but they know the reality is the war's long since over. Russia's won it. They just don't want any mud to stick or any of the proverbial to land on their doorstep. So let's pass it over to the Europeans who are suckers enough to keep it going because their politicians can't afford the war to end unless Ukraine wins, and Ukraine can't win.
It's awfully rich for a the leader of a nation to declare Russia a paper tiger when they themselves couldn't pacify a third world country that hardly had any military at all, i.e., Afghanistan, for 20 years, and then left with their tail between their legs and looking like Saigon 2.0. Yeah, the United States has no business saying that. But of course, President Trump has taken claim to ending 7 wars, including what was the most recent one? Cambodia versus Armenia. That never really happened, but Um, ironically, well, I think the important thing also to note is while you talked about the fact that if once the Ukraine conflict is over, a lot of these European leaders are pretty much their political careers over. Well, it's because of their getting involved in supporting Ukraine in this conflict that we now have the UK, France, pretty much bankrupt, Germany completely deindustrialized, and much of Europe is now in political turmoil with civil unrest going all across the country. It's interesting what happens when you have prosperity based on cheap energy that you got from Russia, and then when that gets cut off, everything just completely falls apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's telling, for that one of the statements that Trump made, and you made the point, Ken, in the UN was basically, well, if Russian drones or whatever invade your airspace, then you have the right to shoot them out of the sky. That's, of course, not entering the Ukraine war. It's got nothing to do with the Ukraine war. It's to do with saying, well, you can do that. Now, in all seriousness, the Americans know full well what the consequences of that's going to be because they're going to sit back and go, nothing to do with us. What Article 5? You shot them out the sky. That's your problem. You'll have to deal with it. And in a way, they're just throwing the Europeans under the bus. They're throwing Ukraine under the bus. And why the Americans do this? Because they can't win any war anywhere in the world ever again. Hence why not just what happened with regards to Afghanistan. Look at the Houthis. The Americans begging them not to. We'll drop all the sanctions. We'll do all this. Just stop bombing our, anything that's European or American or Israeli ships. Just stop doing it because you're humiliating us. And what? And they're not a paper tiger. The United States hasn't won a war apart from Iraq war, Gulf War One, when they actually went in with a stated intention, fulfilled it, and pulled out and left. That's the last time and will never be again the US can win a war because they're militarily useless on every single level, absolutely clueless. So they can sit there and talk about paper tigers. Well, that's again just high octane rhetoric. It's to make it look like we're the tough guy. We're the ones dictating the terms. We're going to make sure the war continues, but we're not having anything to do with it. And obviously, he says, Trump, I wish both countries well, meaning Ukraine and Russia. We'll continue to supply weapons to NATO. NATO does whatever they want to do with them. Good luck to everyone. Well, that's basically, as I say, just walking out the exit, going nothing to do with us, even though the US basically were the prime instigators of being a proxy, the prime instigators of everything that happened prior to the war since 2014, were the prime instigators of the Maidan in the first place, which actually sort of started a bit in 2013 and spilled over into 2014. And the rest is sadly a litany of awful events that have happened. But in essence, it just comes down to the point the US hegemony no longer exists. The US is being proved that they threw everything at Russia and it failed. If the boot had been on the other foot and the Russians had been in a position, they would have destroyed the United States economically very easily if that was possible. The Russians have withstood it because their economy is strong, because of the resilience of the Russian people. Whatever people think about this, that's the reality they're dealing with. And militarily, they're strong enough to resist it. The United States is in no position to resist anything. And it comes back to the original reasoning of this, that this is just nonsense. Nobody takes it seriously except Trump supporters and a few other people. But the Europeans go, well, the Americans are emboldening us. And some of them think, well, seriously, imagine they can take the fight and continue winning. But someone needs to ask them, how many days arms have you got? Munitions. Like Poland, people, the Poles came out with some more high octane rhetoric. They would last 3 days when they'd have no munitions left in a conventional war with Russia that will never happen. But let's say it did. So what happens after 3 days? It's over. They'd have to surrender. So this is why it's all lots of statements in public, but privately. Even the Poles admitted, oh, we just said these things to try and it was a psyop. We were trying to unnerve the Russians. Again, they're just trying to unnerve Russia. Russia sits there and goes, don't be ridiculous, Europe. Don't be ridiculous, Poland. You and I and everyone else knows that's not reality. But I think at the end of the day, the US is so desperate to get this war over because it's a gigantic millstone around their neck that they just simply can't even afford anymore. So let's get Europe to pay for it. Europe can't pay for anything, it's bankrupt. So how long before the whole war folds just on the basis of no money, no munitions, no military to fight the war? Then what? And what's the outcome? Well, nothing is more obvious than what it was from the day the war started. How was Ukraine ever going to defeat the biggest nuclear power in the world? It's impossible.
As an American, we have a tendency to recognize that in presidential elections, it's either the lesser of two evils or the least dirty shirt in the laundry. But in my opinion, after his speech yesterday at the UN, I'm reminded that Donald Trump is still a dirty shirt. Anyway, Paul, were there any other things you wanted to add to this?
I think that's a great way to end it. I mean, yeah, there's a lot we could, but I think that's enough to emphasize the point of. I think only maybe one final point. It's not a. We said it before. When you hear Western politicians publicly speak, the one thing you should never do is take them literally, take them seriously, particularly in matters pertaining to Russia, to Ukraine, to the war, and everything associated with it. It's all mindless hot air that has no basis in reality. And it's there for your consumption to make you believe the crap they're coming out with. And it works for a lot of people, but just ignore it because privately, nothing's further from the truth.
Absolutely. To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.